6 months after that fateful search of Queen Camilla's wardrobe, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell stood in the witness box at the Old Bailey, facing the most important testimony of her career. The courtroom was packed with reporters from around the world, government officials, and members of the public who had managed to secure seats for what was being called the trial of the century. Queen Camilla sat in the dock wearing simple civilian clothes, looking frail and diminished compared to the regal figure Sarah had confronted in Buckingham Palace. The months in custody had taken their toll, but her eyes remained alert and calculating as she listened to the prosecution's case against her. Beside her sat her legal team, among the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in Britain, though they all knew that the evidence against their client was overwhelming. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reviewing her testimony with prosecutors and intelligence officials to ensure that she could present the facts clearly while protecting ongoing national security operations. The investigation that had begun with her discovery had expanded into one of the largest counterintelligence operations in British history, resulting in arrests across multiple government departments and the exposure of a foreign spy network that had operated for over 15 years. Detective Inspector Mitchell, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about the events of September 15th, when you were ordered to conduct a search of the defendant's private quarters. Sarah began her testimony with the morning briefing from Commissioner Williams, carefully recounting the chain of events that had led her to discover the surveillance equipment hidden in Queen Camilla's wardrobe. The courtroom was completely silent as she described finding the financial documents, the hidden cameras, and the sophisticated communication equipment that had been used to transmit British state secrets to foreign intelligence services. When Sarah reached the part of her testimony describing her confrontation with Queen Camilla, she could see members of the jury leaning forward in their seats. The revelation that the Queen Consort had confessed her crimes directly to the investigating officer was crucial evidence that would be difficult for the defense to challenge. The defendant told you that she had been recording conversations and selling information to foreign agents. The prosecutor continued. Did she explain why she had chosen to betray her country and her family? Sarah recalled Queen Camilla's words about needing insurance in a family that survived by being more ruthless than their enemies. The bitterness and resentment that had driven the Queen Consort to treason came through clearly in Sarah's testimony, painting a picture of a woman who had chosen revenge over loyalty. The defense team's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. They attempted to portray Queen Camilla as a vulnerable woman who had been manipulated by sophisticated foreign intelligence operatives, but the evidence of her active participation in the conspiracy was too strong to overcome. The recordings, financial documents, and her own confession left little room for doubt about her guilt. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah met with Director General Thornfield to discuss the ongoing investigation into the broader conspiracy. The hunt for the architect, the British coordinator who had facilitated Queen Camilla's activities, was continuing, though several promising leads had been developed. We've made significant progress, Thornfield reported. The profile that Queen Camilla provided has helped us narrow our search to fewer than a dozen individuals with the necessary access and authority. We expect to make an arrest within the next few weeks. Sarah was relieved to hear that the investigation was progressing, though she knew that exposing the full extent of the foreign penetration would take years of careful work. The damage to British intelligence capabilities had been severe, requiring a complete review of security procedures and personnel throughout the government. The trial continued for 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting evidence that detailed the scope and impact of Queen Camilla's espionage activities. Intelligence officials testified about the classified information that had been compromised, while financial experts explained the money laundering operation that had funded the spy network. The picture that emerged was of a systematic betrayal that had undermined British national security for nearly 2 decades. When the time came for Queen Camilla to testify in her own defense, her appearance in the witness box created a media sensation. The woman who had once been the second highest-ranking member of the royal family now faced the prospect of spending the rest of her life in prison, and her demeanor reflected the weight of that reality. Her testimony was carefully crafted to minimize her culpability while acknowledging the basic facts that could not be disputed. She claimed to have been gradually drawn into the conspiracy through a combination of manipulation and threats, portraying herself as more victim than perpetrator. But, under cross-examination, the prosecution systematically demolished her attempts to deflect responsibility. "You voluntarily installed surveillance equipment in your private quarters," the prosecutor stated. "You actively sought out classified information to pass to your foreign handlers. You received substantial payments for your services. How is this the behavior of an unwilling victim?" Queen Camilla's responses became increasingly evasive as the prosecution presented evidence of her enthusiastic participation in the spy network. Phone records showed her initiating contact with her handlers. Financial documents revealed her negotiating higher payments for particularly valuable information, and surveillance footage from the palace showed her deliberately positioning recording devices to capture sensitive conversations. The most damaging moment of her testimony came when the prosecution played recordings that Queen Camilla herself had made of private conversations with the king and other family members. Hearing the voice of the reigning monarch discussing state business while unaware that his wife was recording him for foreign intelligence services created a profound sense of violation that was palpable throughout the courtroom. Sarah watched from the gallery as Queen Camilla's defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. The woman who had once commanded respect and deference now appeared broken and defeated, finally, understanding that her choices had consequences that could not be avoided through manipulation or royal privilege. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Queen Camilla was convicted of treason, espionage, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit terrorism related to the planned assassination plot that her cooperation had helped expose. The judge's sentencing was swift and severe, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Queen Camilla was led away to begin her life sentence, Sarah felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the cost to the royal family and the nation had been enormous. The monarchy had survived the scandal, but its reputation had been severely damaged, and the process of rebuilding public trust would take years. The impact of the case extended far beyond the conviction of one individual. The exposure of the foreign spy network had led to a complete overhaul of security procedures throughout the British government. New vetting procedures, enhanced surveillance systems, and improved counterintelligence operations had been implemented to prevent future penetrations of such magnitude. Sarah's own career had been transformed by her role in the investigation. She had been promoted to Detective Chief Inspector and assigned to lead a new unit dedicated to investigating threats to national security. The skills she had demonstrated in uncovering the Queen Camilla conspiracy made her invaluable in the ongoing effort to identify and neutralize foreign intelligence operations. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, Sarah received word that the architect had finally been identified and arrested. The individual turned out to be a senior civil servant in the cabinet office who had been passing information to foreign intelligence services for over 20 years. The arrest was kept quiet to protect ongoing investigations, but Sarah knew that another crucial piece of the conspiracy had been eliminated. The revelation about the planned assassination plot during the state opening of Parliament had led to a complete revision of security protocols for major government events. The fact that Sarah's investigation had prevented the murders of dozens of senior officials was a source of personal satisfaction that helped offset the trauma of uncovering such extensive betrayal within the institutions she had served. 1 year after Queen Camilla's conviction, Sarah stood in a very different place from where her investigation had begun. She was no longer a royal protection officer focused on the safety of individual family members. She had become a guardian of national security, charged with protecting the entire system of democratic government. The royal family had slowly begun to rebuild their public image, with the king taking an active role in promoting transparency and accountability within royal institutions. The painful process of acknowledging Queen Camilla's crimes and cooperation with the investigation had ultimately strengthened the monarchy by demonstrating its commitment to justice over self-protection. Sarah often reflected on the chain of events that had led from a routine financial investigation to the exposure of one of the most serious national security threats in modern British history. Her decision to follow the evidence wherever it led, despite the personal and professional risks, had prevented catastrophic damage to democratic institutions and possibly saved countless lives. The case had taught her that threats to national security could come from the most unexpected sources, and that vigilance was required at every level of society. The foreign intelligence services that had recruited Queen Camilla were still active, still seeking to infiltrate and undermine democratic governments around the world. The work of identifying and stopping them would never be finished. As Sarah looked back on the investigation that had defined her career, she took pride in knowing that her courage and professionalism had served the nation well. The evidence she had gathered in Queen Camilla's wardrobe had exposed a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of British democracy, and her testimony had ensured that justice was served regardless of the perpetrator's position in society. The story that had begun with suspicious charity donations and ended with the conviction of a member of the royal family for treason demonstrated that no one was above the law in a democratic society. Sarah's investigation had proven that even the most privileged and protected individuals would be held accountable for their crimes, and that the institutions of justice were strong enough to survive even the most shocking betrayals. The legacy of the case would be measured not just in the convictions it produced, but in the reforms it inspired and the vigilance it instilled in those charged with protecting national security. Sarah had played a crucial role in defending democracy against its enemies, and the nation was safer because of her courage to follow the truth wherever it led, regardless of how powerful or protected the perpetrators might be. In the end, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had served her country in the most fundamental way possible, by ensuring that justice prevailed over privilege, that truth triumphed over deception, and that the rule of law remained supreme even when challenged by those who believed themselves untouchable. The investigation that had begun in a royal wardrobe had ended with the conviction of a traitor and the protection of democratic institutions that millions of people depended upon for their freedom and security. The safe house was a converted Georgian townhouse in an undisclosed location outside London, surrounded by surveillance equipment and protected by armed officers who maintained constant vigilance against potential threats. Sarah had been there for 3 days, watching news reports that hinted at unusual activity around Buckingham Palace, while carefully avoiding any mention of the real reason for the increased security presence throughout the government district. Director General Thornfield visited daily with updates on the rapidly expanding investigation, each briefing revealing new layers of the conspiracy that Queen Camilla had helped orchestrate. The surveillance equipment found in her wardrobe had been connected to a sophisticated communication network that reached across multiple continents, and the intelligence services were working around the clock to map the full extent of the foreign operation. We've identified at least 47 individuals in various government departments who may have been compromised, Thornfield reported during their morning briefing. The network appears to have been recruiting assets for over 15 years, using a combination of blackmail, bribery, and ideological manipulation. Queen Camilla was apparently their most valuable source, but she was far from their only one. Sarah absorbed this information with growing horror as she realized the scope of the penetration. Nearly 5 decades of foreign agents and compromised officials had been operating within the British government, potentially influencing policy decisions and undermining national security on a massive scale. The investigation she had triggered was revealing systematic corruption at a level that threatened the very foundation of democratic governance. "What about the king?" Sarah asked. "Has he been informed about his wife's activities?" Thornfield's expression grew grave. His Majesty was briefed yesterday evening in a private meeting at Windsor Castle. As you might expect, the revelation has been devastating for him personally. However, he has agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation and has authorized whatever measures are necessary to protect national security. Sarah could barely imagine the personal trauma that the king was experiencing. To learn that his wife of nearly 20 years had been systematically betraying him, and his country, was a betrayal of the most intimate kind. Yet he was being asked to set aside his personal anguish and make decisions that would affect the future of the monarchy itself. "The king has made a decision that will shock the world," Thornfield continued. "He has agreed to a controlled disclosure of Queen Camilla's activities, rather than attempting to cover up the scandal. He believes that the monarchy can only survive if it demonstrates complete transparency and accountability in this matter. The decision to publicly reveal Queen Camilla's treason was unprecedented in modern royal history. Previous royal scandals had been managed through careful public relations campaigns designed to minimize damage to the institution. But the scope of this conspiracy was too vast to conceal, and the king apparently understood that attempting a cover-up would only make the eventual revelation more damaging. "When will the disclosure happen?" Sarah asked, knowing that once the information became public, her own life would never be private again. "Tomorrow morning," Thornfield replied. "The Prime Minister will address Parliament at 10 o'clock, followed immediately by a statement from the king. The arrests will begin simultaneously with the public announcement, starting with Queen Camilla herself." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she contemplated the end of the secrecy that had defined the past 3 days. The truth would finally be revealed, but she knew that the public reaction would be intense and potentially violent. The revelation that the Queen Consort had been a foreign spy would shatter public confidence in institutions that many people had considered unshakable. "Your role in this will be acknowledged," Thornfield continued. "Your courage in conducting the investigation and gathering the evidence has been essential to national security. However, you should be prepared for intense public scrutiny and possible threats from sympathizers of the criminal organization." The prospect of becoming a public figure in one of the greatest scandals in British history was daunting, but Sarah understood that her testimony would be crucial to ensuring that justice was served. She had gathered evidence that would be essential in prosecuting not just Queen Camilla but the entire network of foreign agents and compromised officials. That evening, as Sarah watched the sunset through the bulletproof windows of the safe house, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A routine search based on suspicious financial transactions had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of democratic government in Britain. Her decision to follow the evidence wherever it led had revealed truths that would reshape the country's political landscape for generations. The secure phone beside her bed rang in the early hours of the morning with news that the first arrests had begun. Queen Camilla had been taken into custody at Windsor Castle in a pre-dawn raid conducted by counter-terrorism officers. The operation had proceeded smoothly, with no resistance from the Queen Consort, who apparently understood that her situation was hopeless. "She asked to speak with you," the voice on the phone informed Sarah. "She claims to have additional information that she will only share with the officer who discovered her operation. Would you be willing to conduct an interview?" Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She had no desire to face Queen Camilla again after their confrontation in the royal chambers. But her professional training reminded her that any additional information could be crucial to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy and preventing future attacks. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself sitting across from Queen Camilla in a high-security interview room at a location she was not permitted to know. The woman who had once commanded the respect and deference due to royalty now wore standard prison clothing and looked older than her 76 years. The transformation was startling and somehow sad, despite everything she had done. "Detective Inspector Mitchell," Queen Camilla said quietly as the recording equipment was activated. "I told them I would only speak to you because I believe you are the only person involved in this investigation who might understand the choices I made." Sarah remained silent, allowing Queen Camilla to speak while carefully observing her demeanor for signs of deception or manipulation. The woman across from her seemed genuinely broken, but Sarah had learned not to trust appearances when dealing with experienced intelligence operatives. "You asked me yesterday who I was working with," Queen Camilla continued. "I told you it was a consortium of foreign intelligence services, which was true as far as it went. But I did not tell you about the British citizens who were part of the operation, people in positions of significant authority who facilitated my activities." This revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had assumed that Queen Camilla was working primarily with foreign handlers, but the suggestion that prominent British citizens were involved in the conspiracy added an entirely new dimension to the investigation. "Who are these people?" Sarah asked, leaning forward in her chair. Queen Camilla smiled sadly. "That information has value, Detective Inspector. I am facing charges that will likely result in life imprisonment, assuming I survive long enough to stand trial. The organization I worked with does not tolerate failure, and they have already demonstrated their reach by compromising officials throughout your government. Sarah recognized the attempt at negotiation, but also understood that Queen Camilla genuinely feared for her life. The criminal organization she had served would view her capture as an existential threat to their operation, and they had already proven their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. "What do you want?" Sarah asked bluntly. "Protection for my family members who knew nothing about my activities," Queen Camilla replied immediately, "and assurance that the full truth about how I was recruited and manipulated will be revealed, not just the simple narrative that I was a willing traitor." Sarah considered the request carefully. Queen Camilla's family members were indeed likely to face threats from the criminal organization, and they deserved protection regardless of their relatives' crimes. As for the full truth about her recruitment, that information could be valuable in preventing future operations against British officials. "I can relay your concerns to the appropriate authorities," Sarah said carefully. "But you need to provide the information about British citizens involved in the conspiracy before any agreements can be considered." Queen Camilla nodded slowly, as if she had expected this response. "Very well. The operation was coordinated by someone called the Architect, a British citizen with access to the highest levels of government and intelligence services. I never met this person directly, but their instructions came through secure channels that suggested intimate knowledge of British political and intelligence operations. The revelation that there was a high-level British traitor coordinating the foreign operation sent chills down Sarah's spine. Someone with access to the most sensitive government information had been working to undermine their own country's security, using their position to facilitate foreign intelligence penetration on an unprecedented scale. "Do you have any idea who this person might be?" Sarah asked, though she suspected Queen Camilla would not have been given identifying information about such a valuable asset. "I was never told their identity," Queen Camilla admitted, "but I was given information that suggested they had been active since the early 2000s, and that they held a position that required regular security clearance reviews. They also appeared to have influence over personnel decisions in sensitive government departments." Sarah made careful notes of this information, knowing that it would be crucial to the expanding investigation. The profile Queen Camilla had provided would help intelligence analysts narrow their search for the British coordinator of the foreign operation. "There is something else," Queen Camilla said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The final phase that your intelligence services discovered. It was not just about gathering information or placing agents. The organization was planning to assassinate several key government officials and blame the attacks on domestic terrorists." The revelation hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. The conspiracy she had uncovered was not just about espionage. It was about a false flag operation designed to destabilize the British government and possibly trigger civil unrest. The foreign intelligence operation had been planning to commit mass murder and frame innocent British citizens for the crimes. "When was this supposed to happen?" Sarah asked urgently. "Next month," Queen Camilla replied, "during the state opening of Parliament, when most of the senior government officials would be gathered in one location. The plan was to make it appear that domestic extremists had infiltrated the security arrangements." Sarah realized that her investigation had prevented not just ongoing espionage, but a catastrophic terrorist attack that would have killed dozens of government officials and potentially triggered a constitutional crisis. The timing of the discovery had been crucial. A few more weeks, and the conspiracy might have achieved its ultimate objective. As the interview concluded and Queen Camilla was returned to her cell, Sarah sat alone in the interview room, contemplating the magnitude of what she had uncovered. The investigation that had begun with suspicious charity donations had revealed a foreign operation designed to destroy the British government through a combination of espionage, infiltration, and mass murder. The truth that would be revealed to the public the next morning would shock the nation. But Sarah now knew that the full scope of the conspiracy was even more horrifying than anything the public would be told. The revelation about the planned assassinations would be kept classified to prevent panic and protect ongoing counterintelligence operations. As Sarah was driven back to the safe house through the pre-dawn darkness of London, she reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. A career dedicated to protecting the royal family had led her to discover that one of its members was part of a conspiracy to destroy the very government she served. The irony was not lost on her that her greatest service to the crown had come through arresting one of its highest-ranking members. The sun was rising over London as Sarah arrived at the safe house, knowing that in a few hours the world would learn about one of the greatest betrayals in British history. But she also knew that her investigation had prevented something even worse, and that the evidence she had gathered would help dismantle a criminal network that had threatened the foundations of democratic government. The investigation was far from over, but Sarah had played her part in defending the nation against enemies who had infiltrated its most sacred institutions. Whatever happened next, she could take satisfaction in knowing that her courage to follow the evidence had prevented a catastrophe that could have changed the course of history. Sarah Mitchell sat in her car outside Buckingham Palace for 20 minutes before starting the engine, her hands still shaking from the confrontation with Queen Camilla. The evidence she had gathered lay securely encrypted on her camera and in the sealed evidence bags beside her, but she knew that possessing this information had made her a target. The Queen Consort's warnings about the reach of the criminal organization echoed in her mind as she considered her next moves. Instead of driving directly to Scotland Yard as protocol demanded, Sarah made a detour through central London's busy streets, using techniques she had learned in counter-surveillance training to determine if she was being followed. The afternoon traffic provided good cover, but she noticed the same black sedan appearing in her mirrors too frequently to be coincidental. The conspiracy Queen Camilla had described was already moving to contain the threat she represented. Commissioner Williams was waiting for her in his office when she finally arrived at Scotland Yard, his face grave with the anticipation of news he clearly expected to be devastating. The man who had sent her on this mission looked like he had aged years in the few hours since their morning meeting, and Sarah realized that he too understood the potential magnitude of what they were dealing with. "Report," Williams said simply as Sarah closed the door behind her and activated the electronic privacy shield that would prevent anyone from monitoring their conversation. Sarah laid out the evidence methodically, watching Williams's expression grow darker with each revelation. The financial documents were damaging enough, but when she described the surveillance equipment hidden in Queen Camilla's wardrobe, the commissioner's face went pale. When she recounted the Queen Consort's confession and threats, Williams stood up abruptly and walked to his window, staring out at the London skyline as if seeking answers in the maze of buildings and streets. "Espionage," he said quietly, the word hanging in the air between them like a death sentence. "She's admitted to conducting espionage operations against the royal family and selling intelligence to foreign agents." Sarah nodded, still struggling to fully accept the reality of what she had uncovered. "She claims to have compromising information about people throughout the government and police force. She was quite specific about having leverage over officials in various departments." Williams turned back to face her, his expression grim. "That explains the timing of this investigation. 3 weeks ago, we received intelligence from MI5 about unusual activity in royal protection protocols. There had been security breaches that couldn't be explained, classified information appearing in foreign intelligence reports. They suspected a mole, but never imagined it could be someone at this level. The revelation that the intelligence services were already aware of security problems added another layer of complexity to the situation." Sarah realized that her investigation had been part of a larger counterintelligence operation designed to identify the source of the leaks. But discovering that the Queen Consort herself was the traitor was an outcome that no one had anticipated. "What's our next move?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Williams was quiet for a long moment before responding. "The Prime Minister needs to be briefed immediately. This is beyond police jurisdiction now. It's a matter of national security at the highest level. But first, we need to secure you. If Queen Camilla's threats are accurate, you're in considerable danger." As if summoned by their conversation about security threats, Williams's secure phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for emergency communications. The conversation that followed was brief and conducted entirely in code phrases, but Sarah could see from the commissioner's increasingly tense expression that the news was not good. "That was MI5, Williams said after ending the call. They've detected unusual communication patterns emanating from Buckingham Palace within the last hour. It appears that Queen Camilla has activated whatever network she's been operating. They're recommending immediate extraction and protective custody for anyone with knowledge of this investigation. Sarah felt a chill of fear as the implications became clear. The Queen Consort was not simply going to accept exposure and arrest. She was fighting back using resources that the authorities were only beginning to understand. The warning about people dying if the investigation proceeded was apparently not an empty threat. "There's something else," Williams continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. MI5 has intelligence suggesting that Queen Camilla's operation extends beyond simple espionage. They believe she may have been facilitating the placement of foreign agents in sensitive positions throughout the government and military. If that's true, then we're dealing with a level of penetration that constitutes an existential threat to national security. The scope of the conspiracy continued to expand beyond anything Sarah could have imagined when she first received orders to search the Queen's chambers. What had begun as a financial crimes investigation had uncovered evidence of the most serious act of treason in modern British history. The woman who sat beside the king at state functions had apparently been working to undermine the very government she pretended to serve. Williams activated his secure communication system and began the process of briefing senior officials about the situation. Sarah listened as he spoke in careful code to what she assumed were officials from MI5, the Cabinet Office, and possibly even Downing Street itself. The gravity in his voice made it clear that the British government was facing a crisis unlike anything it had dealt with in peacetime. "Protective custody has been arranged for you," Williams told Sarah after completing his calls. "You'll be taken to a safe house while we determine the full extent of the threat. But first, there's someone who needs to speak with you." The someone turned out to be Director General Margaret Thornfield from MI5, a woman whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary throughout the intelligence community. Thornfield arrived at Scotland Yard within an hour, accompanied by a security detail that suggested she took Queen Camilla's threats very seriously indeed. "Detective Inspector Mitchell," Thornfield said without preamble as she entered the secure conference room where Sarah had been waiting. "You have uncovered something that threatens the foundation of our national security. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest level, and your life may depend on how carefully you guard this information." Sarah nodded, though she wondered how much more devastating news she could absorb in a single day. Thornfield continued with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to dealing with national crises. "We have been tracking the activities you discovered for the past 6 months, but we never suspected that Queen Camilla herself was the source. Our investigation began when we noticed that classified information was appearing in the hands of foreign intelligence services with suspicious regularity. At first, we assumed it was a traditional mole operating within the civil service or military." Thornfield activated a secure tablet and showed Sarah a series of intelligence reports that documented the scope of the security breaches. The information that had been compromised included military planning documents, diplomatic communications, and intelligence assessments that should have been available only to the most senior officials in the government. "What made this case particularly difficult to investigate," Thornfield continued, "was that the source appeared to have access to information from multiple government departments. No single individual should have been able to access the range of classified material that was being leaked. It took us months to realize that the source might be someone with social access to senior officials rather than professional access to their documents." Sarah began to understand how Queen Camilla's position had made her the perfect spy. As the king's wife, she had social access to government ministers, military leaders, and intelligence officials who would never suspect that their casual conversations were being recorded and transmitted to hostile foreign powers. Her surveillance equipment had allowed her to gather information from sources who had no idea they were being monitored. "The organization she's working with," Sarah asked, "do we know who they are?" Thornfield's expression darkened. "We believe it's a consortium of foreign intelligence services working together to destabilize Western governments. They've been operating sophisticated influence campaigns throughout Europe and North America, using a combination of traditional espionage, cyber warfare, and what they call social penetration, the placement of agents in positions where they can influence public opinion and government policy. The revelation that Queen Camilla was part of an international conspiracy to undermine democratic governments added yet another dimension to the crisis. This was not just about royal scandal or even British national security. It was about a coordinated attack on the democratic institutions of the Western world. Why Queen Camilla? Sarah asked. How did they recruit her? Thornfield consulted her tablet before responding. Our preliminary assessment suggests that the recruitment occurred during her early years as the king's partner, when she was still facing intense public criticism and media scrutiny. She was vulnerable, isolated, and probably desperate for any form of support or protection. Foreign intelligence services are expert at identifying and exploiting such vulnerabilities. Sarah thought about the woman she had confronted in the royal chambers, remembering the bitterness in her voice when she spoke about the royal family's ruthlessness. Queen Camilla had apparently chosen to become an agent of foreign powers rather than trust the institution she had married into to protect her. What happens now? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thornfield was quiet for a moment before responding. The Prime Minister has been briefed, and an emergency meeting of the National Security Council has been called for tonight. The king must be informed, which will be one of the most difficult conversations in the history of the monarchy. And we must move quickly to roll up whatever network Queen Camilla has been operating before they can destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. The implications for the royal family were staggering. The king would learn that his wife of nearly 20 years had been betraying him and his country from almost the beginning of their marriage. The institution that had survived 2 world wars and countless political crises now faced the possibility that its very survival was in question. There's one more thing, Thornfield said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that had not been there before. We believe that Queen Camilla's operation may have been planning something more dramatic than simple intelligence gathering. Intercepted communications suggest that they were preparing for what they called the final phase, some kind of operation designed to deliver a decisive blow against the monarchy and the British government. Sarah felt a chill as she realized that the investigation had prevented not just ongoing espionage, but possibly a catastrophic attack on the British state itself. Whatever Queen Camilla and her handlers had been planning, the discovery of the surveillance equipment had disrupted their timeline and forced them to activate emergency protocols. As the evening shadows lengthened outside the windows of Scotland Yard, Sarah found herself at the center of a national security crisis that would define British history for generations to come. The evidence she had gathered would lead to arrests, trials, and revelations that would shock the world. But first, they had to survive the immediate threat posed by a criminal organization that had spent years infiltrating the highest levels of British society. The safe house arrangements were explained to her in detail, but Sarah knew that her life had changed forever. She could never return to her previous role as a royal protection officer, never again trust the institution she had served so loyally. The conspiracy she had uncovered had revealed that the very people she had sworn to protect were not who they appeared to be. As she prepared to leave Scotland Yard under heavy security escort, Sarah reflected on the events of the day that had begun with a routine search warrant and ended with the discovery of a threat to national security. She had done her duty as a police officer, but the cost of that duty would be measured in the destruction of institutions and relationships that had seemed unshakable just that morning. The black cars that would transport her to safety were already waiting outside, their bulletproof windows reflecting the lights of London like dark mirrors. As Sarah walked toward them, she knew that she was leaving behind not just a building, but an entire world that no longer existed. The Britain she had served no longer existed either, replaced by a nation that would have to rebuild its most fundamental institutions after learning that they had been compromised at the very highest level. The investigation was far from over, but Sarah had already played the most crucial role by gathering the evidence that would bring down a conspiracy years in the making. Now it was up to others to decide how to rebuild from the wreckage of what she had discovered, and whether the monarchy itself could survive the revelation that its newest member had been its greatest enemy. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully documented the hidden surveillance equipment concealed within Queen Camilla's wardrobe. Each photograph she took felt like another nail in the coffin of everything she had believed about the royal family and her own role in protecting them. The sophisticated recording devices were not the amateur setup of someone dabbling in petty crime. This was professional-grade espionage equipment that suggested connections to serious criminal organizations or foreign intelligence services. The implications of her discovery crashed over her in waves of disbelief and horror. If the Queen Consort was operating a surveillance network from within Buckingham Palace, then no conversation, no state secret, no private moment among the royal family was safe. The woman who sat beside the king at state dinners and attended classified security briefings was potentially compromising the most sensitive information in the British government. As Sarah examined the equipment more closely, she began to understand its true sophistication. The cameras were nearly invisible, designed to blend seamlessly with the ornate details of the wardrobe's woodwork. The recording devices appeared to be connected to a wireless transmission system that could send information anywhere in the world in real time. Most disturbing of all was what appeared to be a listening device powerful enough to pick up conversations from other parts of the royal quarters. The technical complexity of the setup suggested that Queen Camilla was not working alone. Someone with extensive knowledge of surveillance technology had designed and installed this system, and someone with significant resources was supporting its operation. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond one individual's criminal activities. She thought about all the state visits she had guarded, all the private family gatherings she had protected, all the sensitive conversations that had taken place within range of these hidden devices. Foreign dignitaries, government ministers, intelligence officials, and members of the royal family themselves had all potentially been monitored without their knowledge. The scope of the potential security breach was unprecedented in modern British history. Sarah's secure phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Commissioner Williams. Status report required. Any developments? She stared at the phone screen, knowing that her response would set in motion events that could not be undone. Once she reported what she had found, there would be no going back. The investigation would expand, more officers would become involved, and the secret she was uncovering would begin its inevitable journey toward public exposure. But before she could respond, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside the Queen's chambers. Sergeant Thompson's voice carried clearly through the door as he spoke to someone approaching. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but Detective Inspector Mitchell is conducting a security inspection of your quarters. Perhaps you could return in an hour?" Queen Camilla's reply made Sarah's blood run cold. A security inspection? How interesting. I think I should like to observe this inspection personally, Sergeant Thompson. After all, these are my private rooms. Sarah quickly secured her camera and evidence materials, her mind racing through her options. She could attempt to hide what she had discovered, claim that the security inspection was routine, and try to conclude her search without revealing the true nature of her investigation. But the surveillance equipment was now partially exposed from her examination, and any attempt to conceal it would be obvious to someone who knew it was there. Alternatively, she could confront Queen Camilla directly with what she had found. This approach carried enormous risks, both personal and professional, but it also offered the possibility of obtaining additional information that might be crucial to the investigation. If the Queen Consort was indeed guilty of the crimes suggested by the evidence, a direct confrontation might prompt her to reveal the full scope of her activities. The decision was taken out of Sarah's hands as Queen Camilla entered the chamber, her presence immediately commanding the space with the authority that came from decades of royal training. At 76 years old, the Queen Consort moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being constantly observed, but Sarah noticed a tension in her bearing that suggested awareness that this was not a routine encounter. "Detective Inspector Mitchell," Queen Camilla said, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tones that had been trained into her during her years of royal duty. "Sergeant Thompson tells me you are conducting a security inspection. How thorough of you. I trust everything is in order." Sarah found herself face to face with a woman she had spent years protecting, a woman whose safety had been her responsibility, and whose well-being had been her constant concern. But now, looking into those intelligent eyes, Sarah saw something she had never noticed before, a calculating awareness that suggested Queen Camilla knew exactly why Sarah was there and exactly what she had discovered. "Your Majesty," Sarah replied, falling back on the formal protocols that had governed her interactions with the royal family throughout her career. I am indeed conducting a security inspection, but I'm afraid I have discovered some irregularities that require further investigation. Queen Camilla's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah caught a slight tightening around her eyes that confirmed her suspicions. Irregularities? How concerning. Perhaps you could show me what you have found. The request was phrased politely, but Sarah recognized it as the command it actually was. She led Queen Camilla to the wardrobe where the surveillance equipment remained partially exposed from her examination. As they stood together in the space that had served as the center of what appeared to be an extensive espionage operation, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. "I see you have found my little insurance policy," Queen Camilla said quietly, her carefully maintained royal accent slipping slightly to reveal traces of the voice she had possessed before decades of elocution training. "I suppose there is no point in maintaining the pretense any longer." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. Despite the evidence she had uncovered, part of her had continued to hope that there was some innocent explanation for what she had discovered. Hearing Queen Camilla acknowledge her guilt removed the last possibility of misunderstanding or mistaken identity. "Insurance policy?" Sarah asked, her training taking over despite the surreal nature of the conversation. She needed to keep Queen Camilla talking, to obtain as much information as possible before the situation escalated beyond her ability to control it. Queen Camilla moved to the surveillance equipment with the familiarity of someone who had used it many times before. "Do you know what it is like, Detective Inspector, to marry into a family that has survived for over 1,000 years by being more ruthless than their enemies? Do you understand what it means to be constantly surrounded by people who smile at you while they plot your destruction?" Sarah remained silent, recognizing that Queen Camilla was revealing information that would be crucial to the investigation. The Queen Consort continued, her voice taking on a bitter edge that had never been heard in her public appearances. "I learned very quickly that survival in this family requires leverage. Information is the only currency that matters in the corridors of power, and I made certain that I possessed more of that currency than anyone else. Every conversation, every private meeting, every secret confession has been recorded and stored where it can be accessed if needed." The scope of what Queen Camilla was describing went far beyond anything Sarah had imagined. She was not just talking about criminal activity. She was describing a systematic espionage operation directed against the royal family itself. The woman who had been accepted into their most private circles had been betraying them from the very beginning. "The money laundering," Sarah said, "that was just one part of this." Queen Camilla laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "The money laundering was necessary to fund the operation, but it was never the primary objective. There are people around the world who pay very well for access to the private thoughts and plans of the British royal family. Governments, corporations, criminal organizations, they all have reasons to want inside information about the monarchy's activities." Sarah's mind reeled as she contemplated the implications of what she was hearing. Queen Camilla had not just been stealing money. She had been selling state secrets and compromising national security on a massive scale. The investigation that had begun with suspicious charity donations had uncovered what amounted to one of the most serious acts of treason in modern British history. "Who are you working with?" Sarah asked, knowing that Queen Camilla could not have operated such a sophisticated network alone. The Queen Consort studied Sarah carefully before answering, as if weighing how much to reveal. "You are a good officer, Detective Inspector Mitchell. Your record shows loyalty, discretion, and intelligence. It is unfortunate that you have stumbled into something that is much larger than you understand." The words carried an implicit threat that made Sarah's hand move instinctively toward her radio. But Queen Camilla noticed the movement and shook her head slowly. "I would not recommend calling for assistance just yet. You see, my insurance policy extends far beyond these recording devices. I have information about people throughout the government, the military, and even your own police force. Uncomfortable truths about affairs, financial irregularities, and various other indiscretions that could destroy careers and reputations." Sarah realized that she was not just confronting a criminal. She was facing someone who had spent years building a network of blackmail and corruption that reached into the highest levels of British society. The investigation had uncovered not just one person's crimes, but evidence of systemic corruption that could shake the foundations of the government itself. "Are you threatening me, Your Majesty?" Sarah asked, using the formal title with deliberate irony. Queen Camilla smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I am simply pointing out that the situation is more complex than your superiors probably explained to you. The information I possess could be very damaging to people who have worked hard to build distinguished careers. I would hate to see such dedicated public servants suffer unnecessarily." The implied threat against Commissioner Williams and others in the investigation team was clear, but Sarah also heard something else in Queen Camilla's words. Despite her position of apparent strength, there was a note of desperation in her voice that suggested she knew her situation was ultimately untenable. "You cannot seriously believe that you can threaten your way out of this," Sarah said. "The evidence is overwhelming, and once the investigation becomes public, no amount of blackmail will protect you." Queen Camilla's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the fear that lurked beneath her confident facade. "You have no idea what forces you are dealing with, Detective Inspector. The people I work with do not appreciate failure, and they do not tolerate exposure. If this investigation proceeds, people will die." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine as she realized that Queen Camilla was not just threatening to reveal embarrassing information about government officials. She was suggesting that the criminal organization she worked with was prepared to commit murder to protect their operation. "Then, perhaps you should consider cooperating with the investigation," Sarah suggested. "Protection can be arranged for people who are willing to testify against their criminal associates." Queen Camilla laughed again, the sound even more hollow than before. "Protection? You think your government can protect me from the kind of people I have been dealing with? These are organizations that have infiltrated every level of society, Detective Inspector. They have people in your police force, in your intelligence services, in your government. There is nowhere to hide from them." Sarah felt the weight of the conspiracy pressing down around her as she began to understand the true scope of what she had uncovered. This was not just a case of royal corruption. It was evidence of foreign intelligence penetration into the highest levels of British society. The surveillance equipment in Queen Camilla's wardrobe was just one small part of a much larger network that threatened the security of the entire nation. As the afternoon light faded outside the palace windows, Sarah realized that her life had changed forever in the space of a few hours. She had entered the Queen's chambers that morning as a loyal protection officer conducting a routine investigation. She was leaving as someone who possessed knowledge that could destroy the monarchy and expose a criminal conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the British government. The conversation with Queen Camilla had provided crucial information for the investigation, but it had also revealed the enormous dangers that lay ahead. Sarah now understood that she was not just gathering evidence for a criminal trial. She was uncovering a threat to national security that required immediate action at the highest levels of government. As Queen Camilla walked away from their confrontation with the regal bearing that had never left her despite her confessions of guilt, Sarah knew that the Real investigation was just beginning. The evidence she had gathered would need to be analyzed by experts. The criminal network would need to be mapped and infiltrated, and the full extent of the security breach would need to be determined. But first, she had to get out of the palace alive. As she packed up her evidence and prepared to leave the Queen's chambers, Sarah could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the conspiracy Queen Camilla had described was already moving to contain the threat she represented. The walk back through the golden corridors of Buckingham Palace felt like a journey through enemy territory. Every guard she passed, every staff member she encountered, was now a potential threat. The institution she had served loyally for over a decade had become a maze of danger and deception, and Sarah no longer knew who she could trust. Her secure phone buzzed again with another message from Commissioner Williams, but Sarah hesitated before responding. Queen Camilla's warnings about corruption within the police force echoed in her mind, raising questions about whether even her own superior could be trusted with the information she had uncovered. As she finally reached the exit from the palace grounds, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career and possibly her life. She would report her findings to Commissioner Williams, but she would also take steps to protect herself and the evidence she had gathered. The conspiracy she had uncovered was too dangerous to trust to any single person or institution. The game had changed, and Sarah Mitchell was no longer just a police officer following orders. She was now a key player in a deadly contest that would determine the fate of the British monarchy and possibly the security of the nation itself. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had served the Crown Protection Unit for 12 years, but she had never received an order quite like this one. Standing in the marble-floored corridor outside the Queen's private chambers, she clutched the official warrant in her trembling hands. The heavy paper bore the seal of Scotland Yard and the signature of Commissioner Williams himself, but the words printed there seemed impossible to believe. Search the private quarters of Her Majesty Queen Camilla Parker Bowles for evidence relating to Operation Nightingale. Sarah had dedicated her entire career to protecting the royal family. She had taken bullets meant for princes, stood guard through countless state dinners, and sworn an oath that bound her very soul to the service of the crown. Now, at 34 years old, with commendations covering her office wall and the respect of every officer in the protection unit, she was being asked to violate everything she believed in. The corridor stretched before her like a golden tunnel, its walls lined with portraits of monarchs who had ruled Britain for centuries. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished floor, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of tourists gathering outside the palace gates. Life was continuing normally beyond these walls, but inside, something fundamental was about to change. Commissioner Williams had called her into his office that morning with an expression she had never seen before. The man who had commanded respect from every officer in London looked tired, almost broken. His usually immaculate uniform was wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he poured himself a cup of tea that would grow cold and remain untouched throughout their conversation. "Sarah," he had said, his voice heavy with the weight of unspoken burdens, "what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Not until the investigation is complete. Not until we know the full extent of what we're dealing with." She had nodded, expecting another briefing about terrorist threats or security concerns for an upcoming royal engagement. Instead, Williams had slid a manila folder across his desk, its contents so sensitive that it bore no markings except for a single red stamp. Eyes only, commissioner level. 3 weeks ago, our financial crimes unit received a tip about unusual money transfers connected to several royal charities, Williams had explained, his eyes never meeting hers directly. What started as a routine investigation into potential embezzlement has uncovered something much more serious. We have reason to believe that someone with access to the highest levels of the royal household has been using their position to facilitate money laundering for international criminal organizations. Sarah had felt her world tilt on its axis. "Sir, surely you don't mean—" "I don't mean anything yet," Williams had interrupted sharply. "That's why we need this search. We need evidence, and we need it obtained legally and properly. The Queen Consort's quarters contain a private office where she handles her charitable correspondence. Our investigation suggests that someone has been using those charities as fronts, and we need to determine if Her Majesty is a victim of this scheme or—" He had trailed off, unable to voice the alternative. The weight of that unfinished sentence had settled on Sarah's shoulders like a lead blanket. She had stared at the warrant, reading and rereading the carefully worded legal language that would authorize her to search through the most private spaces of a woman she had sworn to protect. The irony was not lost on her that her years of loyal service, her proven discretion and unwavering loyalty, were exactly the qualities that made her the perfect candidate for this impossible task. "Why me?" she had asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because you're the only one I trust to do this right," Williams had replied. "Because if there's an innocent explanation for what we've uncovered, you'll find it. And if there isn't—" He had stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the London skyline as if seeking answers in the maze of rooftops and chimneys. "If there isn't, then the monarchy as we know it may not survive what comes next." Now, standing outside those private quarters, Sarah understood the full magnitude of what she was about to do. The Queen's chambers were not just rooms. They were sanctuary, the one place where the woman who had married into the world's most scrutinized family could retreat from the constant gaze of the public eye. To violate that sanctuary felt like a desecration of everything Sarah had spent her career defending. She thought about Queen Camilla herself, a woman who had endured decades of public criticism and media scrutiny before finally earning a measure of acceptance from the British people. The Queen Consort had worked tirelessly to rehabilitate her image, throwing herself into charitable work and public service with a dedication that had impressed even her harshest critics. The idea that this same woman might be involved in criminal activity seemed not just unlikely, but actively cruel. But Sarah was not naive. She had seen enough in her years of police work to know that appearances could be deceiving, that even the most trusted individuals were capable of shocking betrayals. She had arrested priests who had stolen from their congregations, teachers who had exploited their students, and politicians who had sold their votes to the highest bidder. If there was one lesson that law enforcement had taught her, it was that no one was above suspicion when evidence pointed in their direction. The security guard stationed outside the Queen's chambers nodded respectfully as Sarah approached. Sergeant Thompson was a career military man who had served in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Protection Detail. His weathered face showed no curiosity about Sarah's presence, but she could see the question in his eyes. Royal Protection officers did not typically enter the Queen's private quarters unannounced, especially not carrying official paperwork that bore the look of a legal warrant. "Sergeant Thompson," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the authority that came with her rank despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. "I need to conduct a security inspection of Her Majesty's chambers. This is official business." Thompson's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He had been in service long enough to recognize the difference between routine security checks and something more serious. "Of course, ma'am. Her Majesty is in London today for a charity luncheon. The chambers are unoccupied." Sarah nodded her thanks and watched as Thompson unlocked the heavy wooden door that led into the Queen's private world. The locks were state-of-the-art, requiring both a traditional key and an electronic card to open, but Thompson's access granted them both entry into spaces that most people would never see. The first room they entered was a sitting area, elegantly furnished, but unmistakably lived in. Personal photographs covered the side tables, showing family gatherings and informal moments that the public never witnessed. Books were stacked on a reading table, their bookmarks suggesting regular use, and a half-finished crossword puzzle lay abandoned on a leather armchair. This was not the formal, museum-like atmosphere of the public royal apartments, but the comfortable, slightly cluttered space of someone who actually lived here. Sarah felt like an intruder, a sensation made worse by the knowledge that what she was doing was not only legal but necessary. She had conducted hundreds of searches throughout her career, but none had felt quite so personal, quite so much like a violation of trust. Every item she examined seemed to mock her conflicted feelings about the situation. "I'll need to search the office area," she told Thompson, who nodded and led her down a short hallway lined with watercolor paintings of the English countryside. The office was smaller than Sarah had expected, more personal study than formal workspace. A writing desk sat beneath a large window, its surface covered with correspondence, appointment books, and the tools of someone who still preferred handwritten notes to digital communication. This was where the real work would begin. According to the intelligence that had prompted this search, financial records related to the suspicious charitable activities should be somewhere in this room. Sarah pulled on latex gloves and began the methodical process of examining every drawer, every file, every piece of paper that might contain evidence of wrongdoing. The first hour of searching yielded nothing more suspicious than appointment schedules and thank you notes for charity events. Sarah found herself hoping that the entire investigation was based on mistaken information, that she would find nothing incriminating and could report back to Commissioner Williams that the Queen Consort was clearly innocent of any wrongdoing. But as she moved deeper into the office, examining filing cabinets and storage boxes, Sarah began to notice patterns that troubled her. Financial documents were meticulously organized, but certain months seemed to be missing from the charity correspondence. Bank statements for several of the Queen's patronages showed large donations from sources that were listed only as anonymous benefactors, and the amounts were substantial enough to raise questions about their legitimacy. It was in the bottom drawer of an antique filing cabinet that Sarah found the first piece of evidence that made her heart sink. Hidden beneath a stack of outdated letterhead was a folder marked Private Correspondence, Confidential. Inside were letters written on expensive stationery, bearing the letterhead of several offshore investment firms. The letters discussed the transfer of funds through what they euphemistically called alternative channels, and they were signed with initials that Sarah recognized from the intelligence briefing she had received. But it was the final item in the folder that stopped Sarah cold. A handwritten note, clearly in Queen Camilla's distinctive script, acknowledging receipt of funds and promising that future donations would be handled with the same discretion as always. The note was addressed to someone identified only as CM and dated just 6 weeks earlier. Sarah sat back in the desk chair, staring at the incriminating document in her hands. This was not the innocent explanation she had been hoping to find. This was evidence of active participation in whatever scheme the Financial Crimes Unit had uncovered. The woman she had sworn to protect, the woman she had defended in countless conversations with skeptical colleagues and friends, appeared to be exactly what the investigation suggested. The implications were staggering. If Queen Camilla was indeed involved in money laundering for criminal organizations, the scandal would not only destroy her personally, but would inflict tremendous damage on the monarchy itself. The institution that had survived 2 world wars, the abdication crisis, and countless political upheavals might not survive a revelation that the Queen Consort was a common criminal. Sarah carefully photographed the documents with the secure camera provided by the investigation team, making sure to capture every detail that might be relevant to the case. As she worked, her mind raced through the potential consequences of what she was documenting. She thought about the royal family's younger members, innocent of any wrongdoing, whose lives would be forever changed by this scandal. She thought about the thousands of people who worked for the royal household, whose livelihoods depended on an institution that might soon face an existential crisis. But, most of all, she thought about her own role in what was unfolding. By following orders and conducting this search properly, she was ensuring that justice would be served, regardless of the perpetrator's station in life. Yet she was also participating in the destruction of something that millions of people around the world held dear. The monarchy was more than just a political institution. It was a symbol of continuity and stability in an increasingly chaotic world. Her discoveries threatened to shatter that symbol forever. As Sarah prepared to expand her search to other areas of the Queen's chambers, she wondered if there might be more evidence hidden elsewhere. The professional side of her mind cataloged the various hiding places that wealthy criminals typically use to conceal incriminating materials. Safes, hidden compartments, and personal items were all possibilities that needed to be thoroughly examined. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, casting the office in deeper shadows as Sarah moved on to search the Queen's bedroom and dressing areas. These spaces felt even more private, more personal than the office had been. Family photographs covered the bedside tables, and personal items were scattered about with the casual disorder of someone who lived without constantly being observed. It was as Sarah approached the massive walk-in wardrobe that she realized her search was about to take an even more disturbing turn. The wardrobe itself was the size of a small room, with custom-built shelving and hanging space for the extensive collection of formal wear required by royal duties. But it was not the clothes themselves that caught Sarah's attention. It was what appeared to be a sophisticated security system built discreetly into the wardrobe's framework. Hidden cameras, recording equipment, and what looked like communication devices were concealed among the hanging garments and storage boxes. This was not the simple wardrobe of even a very wealthy woman. This was a surveillance center disguised as a closet. Sarah realized that whatever Queen Camilla was involved in, it was far more complex and far more dangerous than simple financial crime. The discovery filled Sarah with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the late afternoon chill seeping through the palace windows. She was no longer investigating a case of embezzlement or money laundering. She had stumbled into something that looked very much like espionage, and the implications of that realization would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the hallowed halls of Buckingham Palace, where secrets whisper through golden corridors and loyalty is measured in blood, one royal guard received an order that would shatter the very foundation of royal protocol. When Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell was commanded to search Queen Camilla's private chambers, She never imagined that what she would discover would expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the British monarchy. This isn't just another royal scandal. This is the true story of how one woman's courage to follow orders, despite her personal convictions, uncovered a truth so explosive that it threatened to bring down the institution that has stood for over 1,000 years. What Detective Inspector Mitchell found hidden in the Queen's wardrobe wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was proof of a betrayal that went straight to the heart of the crown itself. From the moment she stepped into those private chambers, Mitchell knew her life would never be the same. But she had no idea that her discovery would set in motion events that would rock the very foundations of the British Empire and force her to choose between her oath to the crown and her duty to justice. Prepare yourself for a story of loyalty, betrayal, and the price of truth in the most powerful institution on earth.